St. Anne's Catholic Church here in Bartlett. It's a pretty big church. If you think about the Catholic Church, some people would say that it began with St. Peter, that he was the first pope. Most Baptists wouldn't believe that. We know for sure that the Catholic Church existed by 1054 because that's when it split from the Eastern Orthodox Church in the Great Schism. And in the 1,000 years since then, it has made it to every corner of the globe. Every country on the planet has some kind of Catholic presence. How did Catholics get to so many places with their understanding of Christianity? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's session. Hope you enjoy it. Welcome back to Introduction to Missions and our survey of the history of Christian missions, or as Kenneth Scott Latourette says, the history of the expansion of Christianity. Today we're going to be picking up by looking at the work of the Roman Catholic Church up until the time of Carey. Just kind of to get a running start and a reminder, remember we started by looking at the early church, talked about how the gospel began to spread through the year 300, actually 315 with the Edict of Milan. We're going to kind of back up and pick up there again today. Then yesterday we looked at how God was at work in the Celtic churches. And you see that by the year 600, we're going to see the Celtic churches merging in with the early church and becoming what is basically then going to be known as the Roman Catholic Church until the time of Martin Luther. So today we're going to be looking at the three main eras in the Roman Catholic missions during this time. We're going to then look at some of the key players, and following that, we're going to be looking at some of the reasons for the decline of Catholic missions as we enter into the 1800s. So let's start by looking at some of the eras in Roman Catholic missions. The first one being missions in the Roman Empire from 315 to 500. Earlier we discussed the fact that from the time of Constantine and the Edict of Milan, Christianity was primarily a tool for economic and political expansion. There were some authentic missionary motive, but the Christianity that spread to the West was primarily Roman Catholic and was largely tied to mass evangelism. A couple of days ago we looked at the exceptions with some of the monastic work, but by and large, authority like that which the government demonstrated was being used to allow for faster movement, but it was also slower to adapt and less likely to really get in and do the hard work of disciple making. Latin-speaking churches with Roman priests went everywhere with the authority of the government behind them, but adapting to the language and the culture of the people was slow. Similar to the Judaizers trying to make Gentile Jews before they could become Christians, the Roman Church was trying to make them Latin before they could become Christian. Later, next week, we're going to start talking about the colonial era, and we're going to see that Protestant colonialists were making the same mistake, and people sometimes are still making those same mistakes today. Just a little footnote asterisk. That's why we actually study the history of Christian missions. Even from the people who did it poorly, we can learn some good things, and those who did it well, we can also pick up some warnings. So as we're going through this survey, I hope you're taking note of what are the good ideas and what are the bad ideas. But back to Catholic missions in the Roman Empire. The Catholic methodology made limited use of translation or education. Their goal was to reach the masses and to control public expression of the faith. But the faith is discredited when biblical Christianity is erased by cultural Christendom. And in most places, the teachings of the Bible were being replaced by syncretism. The next era was the missions in the Dark Ages. That would be from about 500 with the fall of the Roman Empire until about 1200 or towards the end of the Crusades. During this period, the church was growing largely through power encounters. Some of these encounters were of a spiritual nature. The most usual form was a military power encounter. As we mentioned earlier, the Germanic tribes encountering Rome at the end of the Roman era were also encountering the church. One of those tribes, one of the larger tribes, were the Franks. They were led by a man at this period by the name of Clovis. Clovis was a pagan. He was married to a Christian, and one night, on the verge of a defeat in battle, he prayed and said that if he was granted victory in battle, he would convert to Christianity. He won the battle, and on Christmas Day in 496, he and 3,000 of his troops were baptized. Over the following centuries, many such mass conversions led to the Christianization of Europe, but the question remains, how many people came to faith in Jesus, and how many entered into a political world known as Christendom, which was just a synonym for Western Europe? The Crusades, of course, were the most significant version of power encounters at the other end of this era. They lasted from 1095 to 1291 and cost tens of thousands of people their lives, damaged Christian-Muslim relationships even to this day, and in the end resulted in no long-term military successes. From 1200 to 1800, we see the rise of the missionary orders. In some ways, this was the most prolific missions activity of the Catholic Church, and in many ways the most biblical. Not always completely right in their theology, but this was the most biblical period of time. There are several different monastic orders. We're going to look at them briefly. In 1210, the Franciscans were founded by Francis of Assisi. When he was a young man, his mind was filled with visions of battle glory and community recognition. After encountering the reality of war and actually even being taken prisoner, he began to rethink his purpose in life. He was contemplating what he should do when his attention was drawn to a rundown chapel. He heard a voice calling him to restore my church. He took that quite literally, and using his father's resources, he rebuilt the chapel. His father, who was a wealthy merchant, was not too pleased with this and brought young Francis before the bishop to complain. Francis said that if the things of his fathers were not to be used for the kingdom, then he wanted no part of them. Stripping off the very clothes he was wearing, he renounced his inheritance, eventually went on to found the Franciscan order. Later, he became convinced that the way to reach Muslims and to end the Crusades was to show love, not hate. He walked to the front lines singing praise songs and attracted the attention of the leader of the Muslim forces. The Sultan of Egypt called him to come and share with him what he had to say, what he was talking about, what he was singing about. He had the opportunity to share the gospel poorly due to lack of an understanding of the language. But as far as history records, he was the first Christian to try to share the gospel with Muslims in a public way. Not very long after that, in 1218, the Dominicans were formed. They were scholars and teachers trained in homiletics, and they became the arm of teaching for the Catholic Church, and consequently the arm for the Inquisition, which began in 1478. Many non-Catholics were bribed and forced to enter into the church, including a lot of the Jewish community in Europe. They were told they would either have to leave or convert to Christianity, or in that form into Catholicism. So many would say that they had converted, but they hadn't. And so the Inquisition was developed originally as a discipleship tool, as a way to make sure that people were teaching proper doctrine. But very quickly it came to be a way of attacking those considered to be teaching heresy. There's no excuse for the torture and abuse related to the Inquisition, but at the same time it should be understood within the context of its era. Fewer people were persecuted by the church than are often imagined, and the ones who were would have been treated far worse in most cases by secular courts. And the thinking was, if it is a crime to steal someone's physical property, how much worse is it to steal someone's soul by deceiving them with false doctrine? Again, that doesn't make the torture okay, but that was the thinking behind how severe the Inquisition was. In 1540, the Jesuits, also known as the Society of Jesus, were founded by Ignatius of Loyola, and they gave leadership to the Counter-Reformation. That was a call from within the Catholic Church to take the charges of Martin Luther seriously, to not just wholesale divide the church, but to reform the church according to the things that he taught, and to return to the true teachings of the Bible. Ignatius was recuperating from wounds he had gotten in a military battle. He actually was so vain that it bothered him that his leg began healing a little bit crooked, and so he broke it again. And it was the second convalescence during which he started reading some spiritual books and received a conversion experience and a call to deeper discipleship. He created an order of men and women committed to following and spreading the gospel. Stephen Neal has called this founding of the Jesuits as perhaps the most important event in the missionary history of the Roman Catholic Church. For political reasons, the Jesuits were disbanded in 1773 and later restored in 1815. There were some theological issues considering contextualization and missions. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to Matteo Ricci. But most historians think it was really a question of politics and economics, like most religious wars. The nation-states of Europe were trying to shake off the power of the Catholic Church, and they resented the influence of the Jesuits. Whatever the reason behind the disbanding of the Jesuits, the move had a disastrous effect on Catholic mission efforts. No other order was prepared to take over their work, and 3,000 missionaries were forced to leave the field, and so it all collapsed. As the church was trying to restore its position in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, it recognized that it needed the strength and structure of the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, who had more or less gone into hiding in non-Catholic countries as opposed to completely disbanding. And so, as I said, they were restored in 1815, but by then it was too late. The momentum was lost, and they never really gained their influence that they had before again.
In 1622, the Catholic Church formed what is commonly called the Propaganda. Originally, this was a very positive organization, and their purpose was to control monastic orders and make sure that there was a consistency in the message coming out from the church. Later, the purpose came to be dominate and control. The full name of the Propaganda was the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. It was established by Pope Gregory, and Francis Ignoli was the first secretary. He served from 1622 to 1649. He saw the value of local clergy, and for the purposes of mission history, what matters is that according to the Padroado, which was a series of treaties between the Vatican and Portugal from the 15th to the 20th centuries concerning the authority over the churches outside of Europe, according to these agreements, or Padroado, only the Portuguese could appoint bishops. When they were unable to do so, the church began to appoint their own bishops who were more missionary in approach. The church developed vicars apostolic under the Propaganda, so the church could send missionaries and start churches in the places the Portuguese did not want them. That is a very quick summary of what was happening in missions. I'm sure you appreciate that this doesn't begin to cover the depth of knowledge of all of the things that were happening within the Catholic Church, theologically, doctrinally, the things that were happening even in relationship to missions. These are just some of the broad pictures to give you an idea. There were a couple of key players during this time who are very important, and they all are representative of the work that God was doing, and there are things that we can learn from each of these people, both positive and negative examples from them. We're just going to begin to scratch the surface, but I just wanted to have a few people in front of you to think through what God was doing during this time. The first one is John of Montecorvino. After Marco Polo had traveled in the East, European Catholics began to take a greater interest in what was going on in Asia. So Pope Gregory X sent John of Montecorvino, also known as Friar John, to influence the Copts of Ethiopia. Remember, we talked about them as the Monophysites. The Mar Thoma in Chennai, India. Those are the ones that we talked about as the Jacobites, also part of the Monophysite community. Most significantly, the Pope wanted someone to go follow up with the Mongols in China, where the Nestorians had been at work. This is where John of Montecorvino, or Friar John, saw the most success. In 1299, he was able to write back to the Pope and celebrate that he had learned Uyghur, the language of that area. He had translated the New Testament and the Psalms. He had started a church with a choir of over 150 trained to serve in the Mass. Reinforcements were sent, and the Catholic Church flourished in China for about 50 years. But then, as we saw earlier, in 1369, all of the Catholics were expelled by the Ming Dynasty. Not because they were necessarily against Christianity, they also expelled all of the Muslims. They wanted everyone out who was not Chinese. That brought an end to that work. Another person for us to consider is Raymond Lull. Raymond Lull was a Franciscan living about the same time as Francis of Assisi and having a similar life experience. He is considered a giant among missionaries to Muslims even to this day. Lull was raised wealthy and spent his life chasing women, basically. As he tells his testimony, he chased a beautiful woman into a church while on horseback, and as he continued to pursue her, at one point she finally just opened her blouse to show that her body was ravaged by cancer, and she rebuked him for pursuing temporal rather than eternal pleasures. Through this and other visions, Lull began to realize the need to dedicate his life to the Lord and to his service. Eventually, he started a school to train missionaries. He had some concern for wanting to reach the Jews, but primarily he wanted to reach Muslims. He made several attempts to share the gospel in North Africa. Eventually, he started this school where he would teach Arabic language and logical ways of sharing the gospel with Muslims. While he was in North Africa, one of his trips, he was captured, he was imprisoned, he was expelled, he snuck back into the country, and eventually he was stoned, and as a result of the stoning, he died. He did not have a lot of converts, but he was very influential in the era of the Crusades of saying there was a better way to do missions, and he influenced a lot of people. Francis Xavier was one of the Jesuits. He was Ignatius of Loyola's closest friend and ally, and was called to spread the message of God rather suddenly. 2 missionaries were supposed to be leaving for India, and one of them fell ill the day before the ship was to leave the harbor. So Xavier saw that as God's call for him to go and to take the place of the one who was ill. He went to Goa and while there developed the original mission strategy for the Jesuits. The strategy was basically to teach children who would then be able to lead their parents to the faith. He would help them memorize the Lord's Prayer and the 10 Commandments, and then to bring that message home, and from there influence the family to come to church. After a brief stay in Goa, he moved on to South India, and after 2 years, he had 100 or so converts. Then, following the trade routes of his day, the next stop was to go to Japan. 50 years after his death, it is estimated that there were 300,000 professing Christians in Japan. One of those who followed Xavier there in Japan was Valignano, and Valignano would stand in Japan and look to China, and he would pray, "Rock, rock, when wilt thou open, rock?" Meaning, when will the country of China open for the gospel? The beginning of the answer of that prayer for the Jesuits was in the form of a man named Matteo Ricci. Ricci was born in 1552, the same year that Francis Xavier died. He was from a wealthy family and was sent to Rome to study for a career in law, but he became under the influence of the Jesuit teachers and soon felt a call to a career in missions. He decided that training in mathematics rather than in religion would be a way to open the door to service, and after a few years in Goa, he eventually made his way to China, where he attracted the interest of scholars with all of his mechanical gadgets, clocks, navigational devices, musical instruments, so forth. In order to continue building relationships, he began to accommodate to the Chinese lifestyle. He would dress as a Chinese, he would learn their language and use it frequently, he would reach into the higher social classes. He began to teach that Confucianism, as understood by the Chinese, was simply a philosophy and not a religion, therefore not in competition with Christianity. He taught that one could be a Christian and a Confucianist at the same time. This opinion brought him into conflict with the traditional Catholic view of that time, known as tabula rasa. Tabula rasa, the idea behind that is more or less clean slate. The idea that all prior learning needed to be replaced with Christianity and Western civilization whenever the church entered a new culture. His ministry was curtailed in his day, but some of his writings remained in circulation and were even picked up and distributed by the first Protestant missionaries coming back into China some 200 years later. Further down the contextualization scale, even more identifying with the local culture than Matteo Ricci did, was Roberto de Nobili. He was born in 1577. In 1542, Xavier had brought the Jesuits to India on his way to Japan, and Goa remained a Catholic Portuguese colony all the way until the 1960s. Roberto de Nobili arrived in Goa in 1606. He considered himself to be a Catholic guru or spiritual teacher, and he wanted to accommodate Christianity to the Indian culture. He advocated for a hyper-contextualization among the high caste, mostly Brahmin, and so rather than tell them that they were learning about Jesus Christ, he was just telling them about a spiritual teacher and trying to influence them with some Christian philosophies. There's a famous quip about him that even his converts didn't know they were Christians. He was definitely way too far in the accommodation scale. One last person that we want to look at is Bartolomé de las Casas. Again, these are just to give us some representative names and ideas. De las Casas was serving in the Americas. His father had sailed with Columbus and came to America in 1502, into Latin America. In 1510, he became the first priest ordained in the Americas, but continued his life as a farmer and a slave owner. Over a period of time, however, he became convinced that the enslavement of the Indians and the concept of holy war were contrary to the teachings of Scripture. The only biblical and effective means of evangelism, he taught, was through love and the example of a holy life. He began a campaign against slavery and spread his teachings throughout the colonies and the courts of Europe. In 1542, largely as a result of his efforts, Emperor Charles V enacted legal reforms aimed at guaranteeing basic human rights to the Indians in the Americas. De las Casas was appointed the Bishop of Chiapas, Mexico, when he was 70 years old. He resigned 3 years later, but returned to Spain to continue his writing and his advocacy for human rights. He died at the age of 92. Although Christians today are not likely to recommend war as a strategy for missions, some may be tempted to use force of law or emotional pressure to win converts. Some Christians have even attempted to justify murder as an appropriate response to abortion. Consequently, the words and works of De las Casas concerning the power of love and a godly life are just as applicable today, I think, as they were in the 16th century. So what happened? How did the Catholic Church go from being all over the world, sending missionaries everywhere, to losing much of its influence? There are several factors in the decline of the Roman Catholic missions. Stephen Neal, the brilliant missiologist and historian, said that the second half of the 18th century, so 1750 to 1800, is a period of tragic collapse. And why did he see this as happening? He gave 7 factors. The first, political challenges. Portugal and Spain were losing their position as global superpowers, but also Portugal and Spain, in order to maintain their power, were trying to throw off the control or influence of the Vatican, of the Catholic Church. So Spain and Portugal were fighting each other, they were fighting the Protestant nations, and they were fighting the Catholic Church all at the same time. Similar to that would be then, therefore, the religious challenges. Believers from different churches, the Protestants, mercilessly opposed what the Church had done and tried to block Catholic outreach. There were internal challenges. The infighting between the orders that led to the dissolution of the Jesuits, as we discussed above. The Franciscans were fighting the Dominicans, were fighting the Jesuits, and then there were other orders that we didn't talk about that weren't necessarily formed around missions, the Augustinians and others. And so as these orders began to focus on each other, they lost that view outward towards those who needed to hear the gospel. There were also local challenges, meaning local from the perspective of the mission field. Persecution from the governments where the church had been growing began to arise, as in Latin America, there was a move towards independence. We already saw how in Japan and in China, the Ming Dynasty and other local governments were trying to get rid of the influence of outsiders, most especially the church. There were spiritual challenges. As Stephen Neal points out, missionary activity is always a sign of vitality in the church, and this was a period of spiritual retreat and inward debate following 2 centuries of growth and renewal. There were expat challenges, as European leaders felt that locals would need lots and lots of training and enculturation before they could be trusted with the work. Remember, the idea for many of them was that the gospel meant bringing Christendom and Western civilization. And so until the local partners reached a level of proficiency in Western civilization, they weren't trusted to share the gospel or to lead churches, and that slowed the work down. Finally, there were the scriptural challenges, or rather, the lack of scripture. More church material and catechisms, etc. had been translated than Bibles. Many peoples did not have access to God's word in a way that they could understand. Everything that the church did was in Latin, and that just made it very difficult for people to understand and respond to the teaching of God's words. So that's a very quick survey of what was happening in the Catholic Church up until about 1800, about the time of William Carey. Starting next week, we're going to be looking more at the modern missions era. Don't get too excited if you're tired of history. By modern, we mean from 1792 forward, so we're still going to be looking at history for another week, but we're going to be looking at Protestant mission history, those who came before and at the same time as William Carey. Look forward to talking to you about that next week. God bless.
Well, hopefully, as you have heard how the Catholic missionaries traveled around the world and spread their understanding of Christianity, you've gotten some ideas. There are certain things that we would want to copy, and of course, certain things that we would want to avoid. That's going to be true of all of the things that we look at. Remember that we're not studying strategy to copy, but we're always evaluating what we're learning. Hopefully you're able to evaluate the things that we've talked about in today's lesson. God bless.